The Change My View podcast is the work of the reddit.com/r/changemyview moderation team. Welcome to the Change My View podcast. Sorry I'm late, I had a thing. And by a thing, I mean, holy cow, that was a 3.5 hour recording, 210 minutes long, edited down to just under 2 hours. And with the always generous help of Boston Driving is Worse, hopefully it'll at least sound alright, if it not too long in the recording. So, today's topic is consciousness. Rather than make this thing any longer at this point, I'll let the in-call intro stand for itself. I'll only add that if this is your first episode of Change My View podcast and you're not into long-haul, undirected explorations of arcane nuances of unreachable topics by rank lay people where the host may or may not lose his cool a bit in the third hour, then maybe try another episode. But if you're into that sort of thing, and you're that kind of lunatic who enjoys that, well, abandon all hope, all you who listen here, and enjoy the Change My View podcast episode on consciousness.
Okay, we're live now. This is Thursday, January 5th, 2017, the first episode of 2017. I am joined here today by two folks who have been keeping up for over 2 months now, a back and forth dialogue over the hard problem of consciousness. Our OP here of the original post, KDJones, who's an ACT tutor in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Hello, KD, are you there?
Oh, yeah, hi. Good afternoon.
All right, and that's the Redditor KDJones, spelled KDJones. KDJones was the original OP, and we are also joined by Justin, who is known on Reddit as awenonian, spelled Awenonin. So welcome, Justin.
Hi.
And Justin is a student in the Eastern time zone. So that's what we have. So what I wanted to start with is the original post itself, and we're really going to look at this long-term dialogue, why it was so interesting, the two of you going back and forth, and hopefully this can all kind of help us inform and in some ways just basically help organize not just the discussion about consciousness, the debate about consciousness, but like the bare definitions. So to start our journey here, then we'll start with our OP, KDJones, who will be summarizing in shorter form their very sophisticated initial OP posting argument. So, KDJones, the floor is yours.
Okay, awesome. So just to briefly summarize, the hard problem of consciousness is a catch-all term for collections of concerns that philosophers of mind have. The quickest way to explain it would probably be in terms of qualitative content. So let's say you're experiencing something like a cup of coffee. At the very basal level, what some people will insist is that there's a qualitative feature to the coffee cup that can't be broken down in terms of physical quantitative features in the outside world. The hard problem of consciousness is explaining qualitative facts in terms of quantitative descriptions. That's the long and short of it. There are a lot of niceties in there, but that'll do for now. Now, in response to the hard problem, this is really where I pick up the post.
KD, sorry, just a quick question I want to clarify. So, like, when you talk about those subjective qualia, we're talking about things like, you might ask a question, well, does my red look like your green? That would be a challenging question to define, to answer definitively, because if you're always seeing red when I'm always seeing green, I'm just going to call that red, you're going to call it green. It's hard to parse that. We wouldn't know, right? Is that kind of the deal, the area that's tough to get into?
Yeah, that might be a good way to capture exactly what we mean by qualitative fact. In response to something like that, some people in response to talk about these qualitative facts will insist that they just don't know what we're talking about here, that they can't get a handle on what's going on, that all the things I call qualitative features are actually reducible to some kind of physical thing. And I really wrote OP in response to these kind of people. I've always found the hard problem to be a genuine problem, but it just means it's outside the business of STEM hard science as it's practiced. That would be maybe a good way to say it. Science just isn't in the business of doing that kind of thing. We get into every one of these issues in depth, so I'm sure if it's important, it'll come up.
All right. Well, I just want to hear a little bit back from Justin, who's been very patient. I just want to know now what's your immediate. Did you have any immediate reaction to sort of his summary of his post?
Yeah. I think we mentioned it at some point in this thread, which is massive and tough to navigate. But one of the things that I remember coming up, you said that a pencil in water looks bent, and that's an example of something that's really only accessible from your perspective. I think one of the big things I brought up is saying, well, it's not really, because assuming I had enough information about the world, I could tell, what photons hit your eyes and what it would look like from your perspective. That was just one of the things that I remember saying a long time ago. We've since gone off of that. I would say one point, right after you, in the thread, when you after you differentiate between public assertive, private speculative, public speculative, and private assertive, the next thing you say is, unfortunately, scientific materialism only deals in public questions. To my mind, it doesn't seem important to differentiate on the assertive speculative front. Am I wrong about that?
I remember you bringing this up. Yeah. I think part of it might be just an artifact of the way I set up my distinctions. It might be that in reality, we just don't hear about speculative objections to qualitative experiences. I think it is important to make the distinction, just because you could end up with, let's say, there might be equivocation that goes on between knowledge of other minds and knowledge of firsthand experience, and setting up the difference between speculative and assertive domains in private experience is a way to make that distinction clear. So in psychology, we study ideas, we study how people think, but we don't do it from a first person point of view. I think that was the main impetus behind setting up those two categories differently. I wanted to make a difference between maybe not only hard science and logical sciences and psychology, but hard science and social science and kind of logical pursuits and the kind of knowledge that we get from firsthand experience. Whether it actually adds to the hard problem, maybe not. In hindsight, it was a pretty good point. That might take me off of the title a little bit, but that was my thought behind setting up.
And just for fun, would you mind reiterating your title?
Yes. The hard problem of consciousness is a genuine obstacle to understanding human experience.
Great. All right. So I want to look at just when I'm checking out where you guys got into it here, and now I've scrolled into your thread. Just for context for the audience, it's the thread that starts at Swearingen. These links will be in the description later, and then goes to KD, who is replied to by username Fuck the Narrative, who is then replied to by KD. Back to Fuck the Narrative, then KD, and then we get into you and Awenonian. Looking at that, is there anything you think is worth describing before we get into the part between you two?
Not really. I mean, out of this post, there were some good replies, but they were all pretty typical. The hard problem of consciousness isn't much of a problem, Dan did it type stuff. I feel like it really starts when we start talking. I feel like that's the most honest part of the whole post. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I don't think I really referenced too much from what the people before me said. I just came up with something.
Then to that end, what I'd like to do is I'm going to read the last one from Fuck the Narrative. I think it's tier 6 down. I'm now reading out of the post the reply from Fuck the Narrative, who says, "Your brain isn't just a node. It took a perfect scan of your brain and simulated in a supercomputer. Your token experiences would be repeated. Again, if you have a spiritual view of your consciousness which is hindering the development of your worldview, maybe imagine an insect brain and start from there."
Okay, and then to reply to that,
here's KD's reply.
Okay, so in reply to your brain isn't just a note, if you took a perfect scan, I said, do you have citation for this idea that if you took a scan of your brain and put it into a computer, the computer would have experience? Can you prove the existence of actual brain simulating machines, or is that just an assumption? And then in reply to him asking if I have spiritual views, I asked, do you have specific evidence that this is a spiritual view, the view that I'm putting forward? To the best of my knowledge, I'm an atheist.
Great. I think that gets us set up for Justin, for an onion here. So
I said, fair warning, I'm not a philosopher, so if I make a mistake in terminology or understanding, please correct me. You said one of the criticisms of the hard problem is that it begs the question against physicalism. Assuming the brain could not be simulated, or even that there was such a thing as a mind that is divorced from the physical brain, would be assuming physicalism was incorrect, would it not?
And to which I say, very good question. Philosophical treatments of consciousness usually do conceptually separate mind from brains. This doesn't imply a real distinction, though. It is totally acceptable to insist that this is a distinction in name only. The exact nature of this distinction is a huge sticking point. Also, nearly every philosopher would accept a perfect physical, that, I think is what I meant to say, a perfect physical replica of the brain is possible. It might be way beyond our current capacity, but it's doable in principle.
Okay, so let's just hang there for a second here. In terms of the religious question, Katie, you said that you were an atheist, and so you weren't making a otherworldly soul argument of any kind, right?
No, this is totally separate than an argument from soul. It's in theory, what I'm saying should be religious indifferent. It's not necessarily an atheist worldview, but it is one that should be compatible with either a religious worldview or the atheist worldview. I'm really just interested in however we find ourselves, actually experience things. That's the real question. It doesn't really have anything to do with the belief in an immaterial substance or spirits or anything like that. It's a totally separate thing.
Okay, so it's something kind of like the question of whether information is preserved out of a black hole, and depending on how that question would get answered, if it turned out that it was somehow processed and randomized, and there was just no way even conceptually to get back in there and know what it was, right? Is it something more like that? It just could be a nature of the physical phenomenon.
Yeah, I would be amenable to something like that.
And so, Awenonian, is that anything you'd want to add to sort of where we are in the conversation here?
You said you don't suppose an immaterial substance, but I do think that our conversation eventually, at least, weaves its way around to discussing whether physicalism is true. And if I remember correctly, you said you weren't a physicalist, which would mean that there's some sort of immaterial substance, yeah?
This is a bit of a philosopher's answer. I do believe in immaterial things, but not substances. There's a very technical distinction.
Does there exist a circle?
Yeah, circles are totally a thing. Token and
okay, so I would just give my point of view to sort of not to argue it, but just to clarify. Like my argument would be like there aren't actually any circles because a circle is a technically perfect thing that has, you can't zoom in and start to see the pixels anywhere. It's just no matter how far down you go. Whereas everything in reality, as we observed, has some imperfection to it, some granularity, at least at some level. Therefore, in reality, circles cannot exist, right? So we can describe a thing that's a useful tool for understanding the world that is this concept we refer to as a circle, but no perfect circle has existed ever in reality, nor in one's mind, nor in a computer, nor on paper. So you're saying in some sense there are things that exist, but without occupying time or space.
It would be something closer to, like a mathematical Platonism. I would push you a little bit on the actual part of this.
Okay.
I would say that there are, or at least there is, a actual circle. It's just that it's not a physical circle. Just to push back a little bit, I would want to say that there are, or at least there is one actual circle, that there are things that are actually true of circles or the ideal circle, and this is enough to secure its place in actually being. How we get this information about circles is really tricky, and this is what we talk about later on. The whole last part of this post ends up being about mathematical consciousness, how we're able to learn things and have knowledge about math, but that's going to be much later on.
Okay, so for clarity, before human minds evolved, did circles exist?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And
as long as there's a universe, there's facts about circles.
On your view, no, there is no circle that occupies space or time.
Yeah, this would not be a circle that takes up a physical extension. It's not a physical object, it's an abstract object.
Okay, and is there like a separate realm for these objects, or are they universally imbued in the graph paper of the universe, or like where does it live?
It would be something like they're in the bones of the universe somewhere. It's not in the physical part of the universe. It's in the like deeper mathematical reality that underlies everything. The physical reality is just like the Kantian phenomena. You know, it's physical is somehow anthropomorphic. It's really how a lot of my arguments end up boiling down. That
okay. I'm just going to roll down a little bit more here.
Also, I think nearly every philosopher would accept that a perfect physical replica of the brain is possible.
All right, Justin, you're up.
But they'd say differently about the mind, I presume. Also, it's a bit tangential to the discussion we just started, but I'd like to ask anyway. When you want to rephrase the hard problem so it doesn't beg the question against physicalism, I'm not entirely certain what that means. I understand begging the question is having a conclusion be one of the premises, more or less. But if you don't wish to beg the question against physicalism, does that mean you want to phrase it in a way that assumes physicalism is true, or just that you want to phrase it in a way that doesn't assume physicalism is false? I bring this up because if not begging the question against physicalism meant rephrasing the question in a way that assumes physicalism is true, then assuming my understanding of physicalism is correct, that would necessitate that you must frame the hard problem in a way that does not distinguish between the mind and brain, right? I suppose, to phrase another more concise way, is there any way under physicalism that the mind could be separate from the brain?
All right, well, the later replies here get much longer, so I think we'll defer from reading through all of it. But anything you want to add to that, Justin?
Yeah, at this point, basically, I start showing my greenness in this. I really don't know a whole lot about these concepts, and so I'm just asking a lot of clarifying questions, what you mean by certain things, because I've taken an intro to philosophy class, but that's about as much as I've ever done with philosophy. So I'm sort of just, testing the waters here. And
well, the last one here is KDJones' response.
This is kind of different in quantum mechanics and classical mechanics, and we talk about this a lot, but having definite attributes, being of a substance. If you add up all these qualities together, you end up falling afoul of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. You end up with something that's consistent because things either are or they aren't. You end up with determinism. That means it's well-ordered. Anyways, you just get a perfect storm of things together, and since this is something that's proven to be impossible, the universe must be like a neutral monism. There must be a layer past physical where reality actually gets ground out. I think this is a really zany argument. Justin, how did you feel about me pulling this on you at all? This is actually something completely new to this thread. This isn't something I just spout out very often.
Yeah, I'll be honest again. My level of inexperience on this whole thing is making me struggle here a bit. I didn't really understand a lot of what you just said. I remember you bringing up Gödel, and I don't really know what you just argued, but I do remember when you said Gödel and his incompleteness theorems, and I had to go look up what those are. And yeah, it seems very odd to me. It seemed like you were claiming the universe would be complete, and because its laws all sort of prove each other or something like. It's a very difficult thing for me to wrap my head around.
Proof's a big part of it. It has partially to do with the fact that things would be provable. Mostly I brought it up just because of the connection to numbers. Gödel's conditions really only apply if certain axioms of mathematics apply, and I figured I was trying to pull this is not a good lay example, but like a Moore's hand, here's my hand, what's more likely that the external world's a fiction or that I have hands? I figured it's either that we either have knowledge about numbers or we don't. It's more likely that we do. One of the conditions for that would be that we aren't in a complete system, therefore incompleteness. And if incompleteness, then no determinism or something like that. One of the classic conditions of a physical mechanistic system fails.
So we drifted a little there from consciousness, I think, into the free will discussion, which tempting as it may be, I think we may just want to quarantine ourselves for the most part, because there's so much here in the consciousness part just to deal with to begin with.
Yeah.
Because I don't think consciousness necessarily requires free will, right? There could be a deterministic consciousness, right?
Let's see. That's actually a big part of what we talk about. I kind of do push the angle that determinism is, in some senses, it fails to capture the kind of relations that we have to the world when we're conscious. The relations that we have when we're conscious of things are very contingent. They're very one-on-one. It's the power of essence or something like influencing us personally, and it's like a chance encounter. It's not the same way that like a softball hits me in the back of the head. I think there's some like spooky stuff about consciousness, but I realize I'm on the spooky stuff side, so I don't want to like push that as an argument in itself.
Justin, I imagine you have some thought on that.
Yeah, well, my immediate reaction to you asking, could consciousness exist without free will, is to say, yeah, because I don't think we have free will, but I do think we have consciousness. But I can't say I can back that up very well, because it's not, again, like I said, I have basically no experience in philosophy, so it's not like I've thought about these things too often. But to me, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily required, because I do subscribe to the sort of physical thing of consciousness. You sent a picture with all these setups of what is consciousness.
I've been waiting for it to segue and do a quick survey with both of you to say which of these most closely maps onto your conception of consciousness, or maybe a couple.
Yeah. So I took a quick look through all of them. A quick look, so I haven't really considered all of the various consequences of accepting one of these. But I'd say the one that probably close matches what I think would be the higher order theory. It's 3 over 3 down. Consciousness is just higher order thoughts about other thoughts. I think that probably would match most closely to what I think.
Great. And how about you, KD?
Oh man, this is tough. I've been known to be a little bit of an epiphenomenalist. I'm not anymore, thank God. I'm not a big panpsychist. I'm usually not a dualist either. It's kind of the silliest of the options, but the Buddhism side of things, if you take like a bypass at that through maybe someone like the American pragmatist, like Pierce, something more like of an extended mind thesis is where I would be, that the mind is centered on the human organ, but it isn't synonymous with the human organ, that consciousness is something like, it's not an emergent property of a system, it's just some like actuality that kind of like soups out of the soup.
Are you saying that consciousness can exist without brains?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a given for all positions, though. Like, if you believe strong AI is possible, you have to believe that consciousness is possible without brains.
Brains and computers and aliens, too. I just mean, can consciousness exist without matter organized in some way to support it?
So
like a video game, like I could play a video game on Apple or PC, but you're going to need some kind of computer to do that,
So could we end up with like a Boltzmann brain? Yeah, that's fine. So in terms of like something that's spontaneous, something that's not organized, yes. Can it be like non-instantiated? Can you end up with like immaterial substances like ghosts? No. And this is something we harp on pretty heavily. I would try to make a distinction between the actualization conditions of consciousness and the like essential conditions of consciousness. What it takes for something to exist versus like what it is. So I would say that there are like physical things that are required to get things going, but it isn't identical with those physical things.
Well, I think one of the things here is pinning down these definitions, because we've learned things about the brain in the last century that have greatly disturbed what some of the greatest thinkers of the past have concluded. I mean, I think we would have had a very different experience from Marcus Aquinas if he knew about split brain patients, Our definitions here become very important. So I think, would it be fair to say that you said you're cool with the property dualism one, maybe? Top row third from the left?
That or maybe emergent dualism. I think maybe something like Hume's bundle theory or like bundle theory within Buddhism would work pretty well, though. That events are actualities and that these actualities are primary. So like it's a kind of idealism, I guess. Well, let's see. Idealism. so unpopular these days. It's not even on here. It would be something more like emergent dualism. Extended mind thesis would work.
Justin?
I don't really know what the titles, like these titles on this picture are the only things I've ever seen to associate with them. So when you say emergent dualism and it says a sensation that grows inevitably out of complicated brain states, I don't really know what that means.
I don't like it either.
Well, I think it's redundant to some of the others too. Like I think it's you could lose that one and just go with the one right above it and you'd be fine, because that's inclusive of the same category.
There's some
Or like the
redundancy.
higher order thoughts. Your intuition about consciousness personally, you feel like it's connected to the universe more so than just the operations of the brain, though, in some way.
Yes, yeah, it's probably the far end away from identity theory. So identity theory says ideas are just very specific physical arrangements within specific organs. I'm on the other extreme of that. I would say that conscious experiences are essentially something in themselves, and they just happen to accidentally map onto, or at least partially accidentally. It's not totally random. No Boltzmann brains. But some weaker connection connects them to physical states.
And so you're saying there was consciousness before any working brains or computers or equivalent physical constructs. There's something in the universe that had the property of consciousness.
Yes, yeah. There's like a very, very primitive kind of grok. You kind of get into tricky territory there. I would say that our experiences as humans is conditioned heavily by being human. So maybe there was nobody that was like, I'm Dave, the Rock. Nobody had like a sense of personal identity or a sense of body or a sense of properties or any sense of extension, but there was just like that kind of hum of qualitative experience, that like general being, that like actuality. Sure, yeah, that existed.
Was it being experienced?
Yeah, I mean, in like the most brute sense of the word, when we human beings experience things, we're like experiencing them as a particular something. So human beings don't have direct access to this kind of like general consciousness. Like when we have an experience, it's always an experience of something. It's like of my coffee cup or of being here at 2:31. It's conditioned by contingent circumstances. So it's slightly misleading to say that it would be consciousness, because consciousness is something that we usually say, it's the thing that humans understand. It's kind of like the group sense of being. So, it's like being American or being an earthling, The beginning circumstances at the beginning of the universe were so strange that it would be impossible to say that they experienced things, because that's a very man-specific word, but there was qualitative content in the universe, I guess is a way to say it. That sounded really inane. If you wanted like an analogy, really early theories of like Hinduism, the like monistic theories of Hinduism posit that language predates mankind. This sounds like a really ridiculous concept on its face, but if you gloss...
Very smart people who have done a lot of good work on stuff like logos and all that, so, that's not...
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the kind of point I'm making. Yeah, good, very good. Logos would be another good way to gloss this. Long story short, the idea is that there's semantic contents in the world before there are, like, physical people doing things. So there's, like, meaningful content in the universe without minds.
Justin, can categories exist without entities to categorize them?
I think that sounds reasonable. When you say there can be semantic content without people to speak it, or that to me makes sense, because when you said, this is actually something that we brought up fairly recently, was we talked about meaning, and in my understanding of what meaning means, that seems reasonable, because I think one of the things I said was like an apple existed before there was, before we had the word for apple. And to my mind, that's what meaning is it describes the world around us. If the world around us existed before people, then meaning would have to exist before people. I feel like you mean something else sometimes.
I roll some things together, but that's kind of the point I've been trying to lead us towards in the discussion thread for a long time, is trying to bring semantics together with intentionality. So something we both have struggled with mightily in this conversation.
Right.
We spend like probably 6 pages between the two of us just like trying to pin down exactly what we mean by intentionality.
Yeah, it
doesn't go very well
on that one.
You know what? That's a word like I would have to Google now. Like, I mean, I know what intention is. I know generally what an ality kind of suffix sort of refers to. But an intentionality, how is that distinct from just an intention?
So the way he described it to me was it's the aboutness of ideas. And the way I described it to me was you can't just think, you have to think about something. Is that accurate?
That would be very accurate, yeah. The early people that really coined the term and brought it into contemporary philosophy would really push the second thesis there, that we always are thinking about something. But just in terms of bare meaning, that would be a pretty good characterization. Ideas are about things, they're about the world, or about imaginary things. And intentionality is that general property of aboutness. Okay,
so if you're in a deep state of meditation, you're an experienced practitioner who can successfully, and maybe for just a brief moment after a 10-hour session, have a moment of awareness, but without subjects to focus on, right? So in that moment, is it just blackout, or is there a background static that's part of our own brains, or is that thing left over after all the thoughts are gone, but you're still awake and deliberately meditating, the same hum in the background you're talking about that's like in the universe, or is that still a thing you still need a little extra brain to have? I want to get down to the bedrock here.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. It's really going to differ depending on who you ask about meditation. And I think that's the way it should be. Like, I didn't want to like tell anybody that they were doing this wrong. Like, no, Buddhists, you don't lose yourself. It really depends on what you think you're doing when you're meditating. If you're trying to acquire a better self-awareness and you think there is a self, then what you'll be experiencing is something concrete, yourself. So the aboutness there will be of the self. If you don't think a self exists and you're a Buddhist, maybe you think, I'm not aware of anything. My mind is annihilated in the moment where I meditate deeply. So that makes good sense. Their goal is to annihilate the self. So if you stop having that kind of intention, that relationship between person and object, then it's annihilated, and there's no intentionality there. So that's a lawyer's response, but it could go either way. It depends on how you interpret meditation and like what doing it right amounts to.
So I don't know a whole lot about meditation, and I wouldn't know what the goals are.
I'm not an expert either.
Yeah. I have I actually do a martial art, and they talk about meditation, but they approach it from a very scientific standpoint. They're not talking about finding the true self or something. Essentially, what they tell me is they're trying to go for bringing the brain waves down to something like when you sleep, you have different brain waves than when you're awake, and basically the goal of meditation is to lower that state to more like a sleeping one, because it's good for your brain and all that stuff. And so that's really what I know meditation to be, and I don't think that's really important from a philosophical standpoint. I don't think that really tells us anything, because, well, I suppose it's informed more by my physicalist mindset. I tend to think everything is made of physical materials and there's no non-physical part to the brain, so it makes sense to approach it from a scientific standpoint.
That makes good sense. I will add, just to be contrarian, that would work for Mike's example, I think, just insofar as meditation there, like the intention is like self-betterment. So maybe the intentionality there is like some future state. It's kind of some kind of like actualization practice. That's what the meditation would be in that. But there's still like an aboutness there.
Yeah.
The thing. Yeah.
I think there definitely is an aboutness in that sort of meditation. The way they tell us to do this might help a bit, is basically you're supposed to. I know that the general understanding that they tell us is this is like mistaken, but basically the general understanding is you're trying to like clear your mind, and they say you're not going to be able to clear your mind. It's going to keep thinking because that's what brains do. So you just have to not attach to the thoughts. If you see a thought, you'd be like, okay, I'm thinking about something, and then you let it go. And so there is certainly a thinking there, an aboutness of your I suppose thinking about your thoughts. I don't think that this drops away from any sort of aboutness. I do think the intentionality of thoughts was something that made a lot of sense to me once I did wrap my head around it.
Cool, good. I never knew quite where you were on it. Sometimes I was like, I'm just talking about the Force over here to this guy. He might as well just like...
I'll be honest, I still need a little help here on intentionality. I've Googled it. It as the fact of being deliberative or purposive. Does that encompass the way in which we're using intentionality here, or should I go to Stanford Encyclopedia?
I think that's fairly accurate. I mean, that sounds like aboutness to me.
It works pretty well. There might be some technical applications about, like, when we talk about imaginary ideas, we can't, if I think of the perfect cake, for example, I can't really form intentions with regards to the perfect cake in terms of like making it happen. So there's a level of impracticality with the like philosophical high definition of intentionality that might miss out on, but that's pretty close. There's a couple niceties in there. If you check the SCP, you might find something.
I think I read that one and it didn't really help me too much, but he linked me to the SCP and I read it a bit, but I don't think it really helped me understand it.
I'm just going to read the intro out loud here. Intentionality is the power of minds to be about, to represent, to stand for things, properties, and states of affairs. The puzzles of intentionality lie at the interface between philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. The word itself, which is of medieval scholastic origin, was rehabilitated by philosopher Franz Brentano toward the end of the 19th century, 1800s. Intentionality is a philosopher's word. It derives from the Latin intentio, which in turn derives from the verb intendere, which means being directed towards some goal or thing. The entry falls into 11... Oh, okay, fine. Okay, so with each of these words, right, you've got a history for each of these words, right? And its usage, and then it sort of gets glommed onto over time by other schools of philosophy that want to use it in their own way. And, you can imagine a tree of something very simple in the beginning, just meaning directed towards a goal or thing. And then suddenly we've got this whole thing that came together around that, right? So yeah, what's the relationship with intentionality then to the discussion of whether or not consciousness is, whether the hard problem is as bad as we think it is?
Starting out with maybe more contemporary, just so I don't have to rehash old discussion. John Searle, the philosopher that wrote the Chinese room argument, which I know everybody hates, put out an equally hated argument called the Waterfall Argument, in which he argues that basically that semantic contents can't be captured in terms of a complete system or like a syntactical system by itself, that there needs to be some kind of actualizing perspective, that there actually needs to be some readable content already there before the syntax comes in. To bring this into our discussion about the philosophy of mind, if intentionality and semantic content are kind of rolling together, that if the aboutness in terms of meaning is like the aboutness that we have in experiences, which seems on its face harmless. It could be an equivocation. It could be something we talk about later, but that's the basis. Anyways, if Searle's right in the Waterfall, and it turns out that machines by themselves can't supply semantic content, then it just goes to show that machines by themselves, or machines just as bare objects of thought, aren't conscious. That consciousness isn't a formal property of systems, but it's some kind of just state things are in. It's just some kind of bare fact, maybe. There's 100 ways to go from there. Searle doesn't even know, so I won't try to pick up the argument.
Right. Well, I mean, the ideas of some kind of recursive awareness of theory of mind and all that kind of stuff, in my view, might end up just answering the whole thing. But in that area, I was wondering how do you respond to the following. You've got like all these thousands of strokes that we've archived, right? And we've used the diagnosis, the resulting mental problems, the things that are missing after people have strokes or different brain injuries, and like reverse engineered all the mapping of 10,000 different injuries or strokes to get a rough map of functions that map onto one or more brain areas. I know there's a lot of gray overlap, but if you keep stroking out parts of the brain one by one, right? Can you lose the consciousness if you lose enough brain? Can an individual's consciousness be extinguished?
Yes. Individual consciousnesses aren't like Plato's souls. They're not immortal. They don't get their conscious status by being timeless. They are like temporal things. They come in and they pass away. Right. So you could stroke out. It happens.
So consciousness for an individual human being, in the sense that we would say subjective self-awareness and capacity for a subjective experience, that for you're fine shuffling off to part of physicalism and dies when you die. Like, you're good with that?
Yeah. The way I usually cash it out is I say the brain is important for it's a survival condition for the mind. The mind does not survive beyond the brain, but the mind is not identical to the brain. That's pretty much the way to put it.
Would it be fair to say the mind is what the brain does, to borrow from Pinker?
I'm not really a functionalist, so I would not say that the mind is like a definite, discrete product of the brain. The relationship between mind and brain is like really, really gross.
Okay, I'm trying to make that map onto what you were saying about stroking out in a way that those still seem counter to me. If you're saying there's a consciousness that dies with the brain, when enough of a brain dies, then in what sense is it anything more than what's going on in the brain?
Okay. I have a philosopher's example on this one. Bear with me. Okay, so imagine we have a piece of clay, and we have a cast that will turn the clay into a beautiful statue, let's say a replica of the thinker or something. If I don't harden my clay, I can cast my statue and destroy my statue all in order. If I cast the statue, it'll be identical with my piece of clay. There's no part of the statue that isn't part of the piece of clay. But when I destroy the piece of clay, the statue is destroyed. So although I don't like couch consciousness out in terms of like higher degrees of complexity, survivability of the mind and the brain isn't evidence for like essential identity. Like, because one can survive the other and vice versa, they must not be like literally identical. They must not be indiscernible, because there's a circumstance where you can see one and not the other.
Okay, you lost me there at the last 2 seconds. Justin, did you get that?
I was just saying.
I mean, I did, sort of.
And not an audio problem. I mean, I couldn't quite with the grokking.
Yeah. So you said one can exist without the other? So I'm not sure under what circumstances one can exist without the other. It seems you said the brain or the mind disappears when the brain is destroyed, right? Because the mind needs the brain to survive. It seems to me that I'm not sure you could have a brain without a mind.
I mean, we have dead people. There are plenty of brains that don't work. They're sitting in jars of formaldehyde and in like graveyards. So those brains don't do anything. So it is possible to have a brain without consciousness.
But are those brains not damaged in some way that makes them, not the same as living brains?
I mean, clearly there's a difference, but it's not an identity difference. You could cash this out if that was really a worry in terms of like changes of conscious states. So when I'm sleeping, I'm not conscious the same way I am when I'm awake, but we don't want to say that my sleeping brain is somehow damaged or different than my awake brain in terms of identity conditions. It's the same brain, it's just doing different things. The long and short of this analogy was just supposed to be to show that you can separate survival conditions from identity conditions. Like the brain here is the ball of clay, and our mind is the statue. And the mind only produces when the clay is brightly formed, but they aren't reducible one-to-one because the clay survives the death of the statue, and same with the mind and physical form.
Well, then suddenly now we're all in agreement because you have, meaningless matter, and then composed into statue. We'll call that its peak form or whatever, and then termination, right? Annihilation or destruction. But the base matter still exists, perhaps in some changed state. Now it's more like hard than pliable. So brain had
lumpy
pre-state of carbon and oxygen or whatever else, and then eventually there's brain, and then there's death, right? So, to me, that's all pretty mundane physicalist stuff. There's nothing outside of physicalism here so far.
I mean, none of that's mundane, but it all goes to show that just the fact that the brain and the mind coexist at the same time isn't enough to be like that they're the exact same. Like, coexistence is a neutral state of affairs.
Well, there
might be a way to put it.
Because there's parts of the brain that are inaccessible to the mind. The parts that control heartbeat and who knows what else, right?
Yeah.
So it's not that brain is identical to mind. It's that brain is the computer, and the mind, Windows 95, right? It's your operating system. So
okay.
It's not that the mind is identical with the brain. It's that the brain is what the mind does. And there's no element of the Windows operating system that exists if I throw that computer into a pool of lava.
Yeah.
So there's no element of consciousness that exists if I go into a pool of lava.
Yeah, totally. I feel like I'm talking an awful lot. Justin, do you want to jump in before I say anything about this?
Yeah, well, so you seem to say, you said that the mind is not just something that the brain does. I'm on the opposite side. I do think that the mind is something that the brain does, and that's basically it. I'm not really sure I have anything to say about that. You can still have that while still being fully physicalist.
I'm going to link this all back to like our original point about intentionality. I think all of this will kind of fall into place. I think what this really is boiling down to, beyond identity conditions and survival conditions, is whether consciousness is what the brain does. The common consensus on the other side, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the brain is basically a computer. It's at least functionally a computer. It might not be a computer in all of its aspects, but it works as a computer when producing consciousness. And consciousness is some kind of computation or like process of computation. Is that roughly right?
Sounds about right to me.
I think we're good.
Okay. This is where the talk about intentionality and the semantic content of machines and Searle's waterfall all comes in. If Searle's right and semantic content is something over and above what is just described in some kind of syntactical rules and it's carrying out to completion. So, I mean, just to go over that again, if there's something that needs to be interpreted, if there needs to be a perspective brought into a situation in order to bring semantic content into a computated system like that, then consciousness isn't just the product of computation. It's not just a computational thing. It's also something semantic. It's some state of being interpreted or some state of having meaning. And if we can get into the waterfall right now if we want to get into the details. If that argument's right, then machines by themselves lack that quality. That if we create thinking machines, it'll because we created amazing syntax plus some like hard state of like having semantic content. I think that's really what we're arguing about more than anything, is whether the brain actually is a computer and consciousness actually is like a computed thing.
Yeah, so I can't I haven't seen this waterfall argument thing that you're talking about.
This is the quick and dirty. Imagine you have a waterfall, any waterfall. It doesn't need to be a particular artificially constructed waterfall. Imagine all of the rocks that the water comes crashing down on. And now imagine putting pressure sensors or some way of detecting the presence of water on a rock from moment to moment. Now, with these randomly generated inputs, imagine having a program that takes random inputs and outputs chess games. The argument goes that the waterfalls clearly just don't play chess, they're not always encoding this information, that the semantic content, the encoded information comes in on a level that's suprasemantic or super semantic. It comes in at some step that we're missing here by just talking about rules and procedures and applications. Waterfalls don't play chess naturally, so there must be some other way semantic content gets in there, i.e. consciousness. It's a silly argument on the whole. I usually mostly just to capture the idea. There are lots of ways to push against it, but I think the pushes are telling.
I'm not really sure if you're. So you said the waterfall doesn't play chess?
I mean, that's the common like layperson, non-computer scientist intuition. I would say, you know, that even if somewhere in the syntax of some program you can go from the inputs from the waterfall to a game of chess, that's not what the waterfall is about. The waterfall is not like about anything. There's not artifice present. The waterfall is not modeling anything naturally. It's because of something else that it's modeling anything. If it has content, if it's a meaningful.
Right.
Basically, the waterfall is a random input generator to some machine that outputs chess games. Is that kind of the deal?
Yeah, that's the whole thing. I don't know why Searle has to pick a waterfall. I think it's just because philosophers don't know anything about computers. I don't.
And so there's a system in place with understood rules like, you know, dihydrogen oxide molecules falling, and then those impacting plates which operate within some understood physical set of rules of the universe that then at some point output something like a chess game, which is a game we know was invented by humans at some time in history. It didn't exist before that, but outputs within a system that has meaningful constructs for human beings because they invented the game. Out of that, where's the part where it says it's hard to that the hard problem of consciousness is still a big problem?
Okay. It's because some things are about chess, like actual chess games or actual simulations of chess games, or maybe some kind of abstract model of a chess game. These things are about chess. So there's some kind of way this content does get smuggled in. And we need to explain that. And if the resources of just computational syntax aren't enough, then something else has got to come in. Something's got to break. Or you could take the alternate route and just say, well, nothing means anything. Everything's ambiguous. In reality, these are like French nukes. These are like your big nihilist options, but they're options. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like your options are either this or death, but it's something you got to deal with. I don't know.
It just seems odd to me because you said that the waterfall isn't about chess because waterfalls don't play chess, but we have computers that play chess.
You could ask, like, what is it that makes those programs about chess, but makes like a random program not about chess? Like, is it something that we're reading into the machine? Is all semantic anthropomorphized, or is all semantic content natural in some way? Or things just are chess and just aren't chess?
Well, no, it's not that things are and aren't chess. It's that human beings have this word called chess, which we invented to describe a category for a game that we also invented. And then you can tell from behind a blind wall which chess game is the waterfall and which one's Garry Kasparov, because you can observe over time strategies developing with sophistication or observable, pretty much ramshackle randomness, right? So there's no mystery there still for me.
Well, I mean, it depends on how robust the thing is. Like, if it passes a Turing test by accident, is that enough then? Is the random waterfall that looks conscious? I guess that's the follow-up question to that. Like, there are conditions where we could be tricked, but that doesn't seem to tell us like the whole story about consciousness. That goes back to like Chinese room, which is controversial in itself.
You said if the waterfall passes a Turing test on accident, is it conscious? And my immediate response would be, well, no, but that's why we have repeated experiments. If it passes it once and then fails it every other time, and you can start getting into, well, what if it passes it 15 million times in a row, but it's still doing it on accident? And then I'd say you just have to accept the what's the word, inductive results of science. That's just how science works. It doesn't really prove anything. It just shows that things are likely.
Yeah, you can have 500 studies on the same topic, and you're going to, even if they're all asking the correct way of interpreting it, you're going to get one or two that break that anyway, just as a statistical necessity. But yeah.
Yeah, this is actually, I mean, I don't know how much you guys want to say into this particular topic. Induction, I thought, was very interesting. The thing that came up that I actually didn't expect to come up. I don't know. It's just, I don't know. What did you guys think? I mean, it came up with, you brought it up as like an option on how to like break this stalemate. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit? Because I actually thought this was very interesting.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure what you want me to expand on, but I do remember induction came up in our discussion in the thread a while ago, and you brought up the problem of induction, where you basically said you can't prove induction deductively, and if you try to prove induction inductively, then that's circular reasoning and doesn't work. I didn't really have any response to that, but to say, well, if you don't accept induction, you're not going to accept anything in science, because none of it actually works on deduction. It's all induction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to play too much of a hard line like Humean skeptic. That's not very fun for anybody. I really just wanted to like bring up the problem of induction, just as like a by the way. The real thing that I thought was fascinating was that you appeal to inductive reasoning to get out of, I guess, like proof conditions. Like you're saying that inductive reasoning is some kind of intermediary between foolproof and like complete ignorance. I thought that was interesting. Just because
I mean, isn't foolproof pretty much off the table for everything, though? I mean, like I don't think there's anyone that's foolproofing anything, right? Like we could just take that off the table.
I mean, I don't mind being like foolproof on mathematics.
This real phenomenon we're discussing.
I mean, we could go all Cogito on it. I wouldn't mind. I don't mind using the Cogito. So like,
I don't know that person.
Oh, it's Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was a Japanese guy's last name. That's Latin. Got it. Okay.
No.
Never mind. Yes, I do know that one. Sorry.
So, I mean, we're certain about our own consciousness in a weird way. And I don't know if that's inductive or not. If it's not inductive, that's kind of weird. That's like a fourth line of reasoning between like reasoning to best. I don't know. Someone else take this from me.
Well, I don't see where there is a problem of induction, but maybe Justin can help me out.
The problem with induction is you can't prove that induction works through deduction. Basically, there's the two types of reasoning. There's deductive and inductive, and induction's accuracy can't be proved deductively.
Sorry, when you say prove, you're using that casually, not like an absolute proof, right?
No, I mean absolute, because that's what deduction is.
But why would anyone want an absolute on anything in this big messy universe? I mean, it's not like,
because you want to know that induction works, right? That you say I've dropped things 10,000 times and they've all fallen, so reasonably that means the next time I drop something, it's going to fall. That's inductive reasoning.
Right. I would say that I have a high confidence level that it will fall.
Right, and that's inductive reasoning, and you want to know that that's accurate, that makes any sense, but there's no real way to show that is accurate.
Well, I could say that it would be accurate to assess that there's a high probability.
Well, you can if you try to prove induction inductively, but if you try to prove induction with induction, you're using a circular argument.
Well, I mean, but there's not a problem of the dictionary, right? I mean, like every word in the dictionary has definitions that use the other words, right? But there's no real problem because it's a total useful device. Like, so with this, I can look at a history of science and see, systems that have been good at generating models that map the universe in ways that successfully perform predictive tasks, right? Like,
right. And
history of science.
And that's why I say that you can't disregard induction without also disregarding all of science, because all of science is built on induction.
Yeah, induction's just like figuring stuff out.
but you can't prove that induction works. You can't.
Well, why would you want to?
You can't show that it works. You can't show that it
demonstrate
works.
Its utility.
Well, if you try to show that induction works using induction, which is the only option, then you've already assumed it works. And if you're assuming it works to show that it works, you're not really showing anything.
I don't think those little loophole things are ever problems, though. It's not like, it's the God and good thing.
Right.
It's like, I don't think there's hypocrisy. It's not an internal contradiction.
I accept. I think that induction works, and it has been shown to work. But again, saying it's been shown to work and is a reasonable thing is using induction to show induction.
Actually, I'm just making a description. Well, anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, it all has to do with how much you want to invest in the K word, knowledge. Like, there are plenty of, like, intermediary, like, useful things that induction could do without being knowledge. Like, induction could provide just, like, amazing rules of thumb, but you would still fall short of, like, the stringent conditions that we usually put on knowledge, which involve things like infallibility, which is, I mean, take it for what you will. I kind of fall on the side of this that you guys do. You know, I'm fine trusting induction. I'm fine trusting weaker proofs for induction. I think it matters in terms of knowledge transmission, though, if we want to say that what science is in the business of is knowledge manufacture, as opposed to making life easier. If science is about making life easier, then it's like other industries. If science deals with truth, then you're going to have to talk about knowledge in some way.
Right, but knowledge is just on a spectrum. It's not like I can go into the universe and discover what the definition of knowledge is. It's just a tool that the English language is used to describe some suggested level of certainty. I know Australia exists. Yeah. That's an honest use of the word knowledge, because I trust that you're going to use the word to represent your degree of certainty. Yeah. So again, I don't know why we're going to 100-0 here absolutes on anything. Like, okay, like, yeah, I know what you mean when you say knowledge, unless we're like in a deep philosophical discussion.
Let's maybe change it into, I mean, I think the deep philosophical discussion is interesting in itself, but if you want to get past that, we could talk about the particular case of, like, acquaintance, like knowing something directly. If you want to know how that's possible, that's getting awfully close to asking, how does consciousness work? You know, like, knowing exactly how we come to have the contents of the world in our minds is another way of asking, how does consciousness work? So by framing it in terms of the problem of induction, we might be able to get some headway, because we've spent so much time talking about, like, computational theories of mind, whether a system generates consciousness, yada, yada, yada. But if consciousness is like induction, maybe it's not something that can be, it's not a system property. It's not like a formal property of a system. It's just something that happens to be true, or something that happens to be pragmatically true, or, like, contextually true. These are ways to hurt some cats. I don't know. Bring us back to, like, consciousness.
What is and how bad is the hard problem of consciousness? On how difficult or insurmountable this thing is. Do you both share a definition of the hard problem? Are you on the same page, at least as far as the definition of the hard problem of consciousness?
I think so. I'm not entirely certain. I got most of my understanding of the hard problem actually reading the other replies to your original post, and the way they described it. I think we're on the same page on that. I'm really not certain, though.
Okay. And would it be fair to describe your positions as follows? KD, you're saying the hard problem is a serious problem and maybe insurmountable using the scientific method to fully understand consciousness. Is that?
That's a pretty neat way to sum it up without committing me too much. Yeah, that works pretty well.
Okay, I mean, Justin, you'd say that nothing in principle that makes it anything more than just a more difficult problem than some of the earlier problems of the brain. And it's not in principle either impossible or crazy difficult.
Yes, that sounds accurate.
Okay, so the difference there really is on a spectrum of can we really wrap our hands around consciousness with science? And so I'm going to propose that the analogy here to define whether or not we successfully do that would be something like, we'll go back to our map of Australia. Like, I can go on Google Earth and have a really good map of Australia, but it's not always going to be right because, the tides change and waves move and wind blows dust. But you know what? I think our map of Australia is good enough that we could say we got it down, right? So are we going to get to a point where maybe we might not know every little last flicker of synapses, but we'll pretty much have it down? Is that a good rule of thumb here to define whether or not we'll crack this?
This might be one of the substantive things that we actually disagree about the most. The way I treat consciousness is as a very particularistic phenomena. It's like Bigfoots or something. Ideas are things that, like, come and go. So being acquainted with those ideas, to my mind, is what we are aiming at consciousness, not getting in the ballpark or predicting when the signs of these ideas will appear with regularity. Like, it's maybe not direct acquaintance with these ideas, but, like, coming to the ideas on their own terms is an important part for me. So maybe using your map analogy, if no one had actually been to Australia and they just had like a really long stick and they were poking at it from Asia and like coming, checking if there's dirt, checking again, and like doing like a stick poke impression of the outline of Australia, this to me isn't knowing Australia. And that's, I would say, is close to the best impression we'll get of an idea. We're never going to like check the ideas under the microscope.
What to you would it look like to if we had solved it? Like, what would a win look like? Where you'd be like, oh, I guess we did solve consciousness.
It would have to be a situation in which conscious ideas could be like represented in like market values. You know, there are things that people could like accurately commoditize and trade off of. If people could like take bets about your mental state to a stock market and bet like on how they change, if society advanced to that level of degree of certainty collectively, that it could be like a total pastime like that, yeah, that would be the condition.
In terms of medical knowledge about the brain, what level of medical knowledge, like putting aside any analogies or metaphors, right? Like just actually, what level of brain science sophistication would we have to lead to where we would have solved that problem of consciousness?
I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. I also don't really locate a lot of the problem of consciousness like within brains. Like I'm not an identity theorist or like a functionalist, so it wouldn't be a matter of just like,
yeah.
Okay.
But just in what sense can we, like if you were to ask me, you know, do you think the Bills are going to win tomorrow? I'd be like, well, the condition under which I would give up my bet that they will win is that they lose, right? And the guy walks across the line enough times and they lose. Okay, so what like actually scientific understanding would count as...
determinate laws wouldn't be a bad place to start, I guess. Like if there were determinate laws on an input to output correspondence, that's a strong condition, but it would, yeah. I mean, that would be sufficient, but not necessary. It doesn't need to be that strong, but that'd be a good example.
Right. Well, that's a good example for free will, but in terms of just consciousness, though.
I mean, beyond that, we're just going to talk about like degrees of certainty.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what would count as a... You posted on Change My View that the hard problem's a real problem, right? By your post, on your terms, you created it. What would count as a win for the other side?
I guess the biggest win on the other side would be dissuading me of the impossibility of it. I actually have a fairly strong stake that it's going to be impossible.
So you're going 100-0 on this.
I'm a little 100-0 on this.
Gotcha. All right. And it's not like a rule of the universe like the speed of light per se, but it's more like it's just the nature of the puzzle. It's the nature of the tools we're trying to use to solve the problem and the computational complexity of the problem itself. Okay, and let me pick a different version. If it were represented by science as a recursive, self kind of generating thing that emerges out of evolution and brain development, right? You know, the brain kind of using its own tools on itself in a way, and they have this big complicated thing that looks like the Krebs cycle diagrams, but they kind of, here's how it is, right? Would that be enough? That would be memory cool. Interacts with vision and interacts with self-identity narrative theory, and all, you know. If it looked like maybe like the diagram that we have of like the water cycle, I think that would probably be a good level that I think we could reasonably get to. When we model things like the rain evaporating up and falling out of the clouds and running off and running into the ocean, I think we'll probably get to that level of granularity about conscious experience. It won't be enough to predict when rain's going to happen with 100% accuracy, and we'll still get surprised a whole hell of a lot of the time just because it's a chaotic system. Okay. It's the kind of knowledge of when things are going to happen and not some kind of essential knowledge of like the inner workings behind it. Like, there's nothing spooky going on about rainstorms, but they're still hard to know about on a particular rainstorm by rainstorm basis. Justin?
Yeah, so I would say we understand, you know, rainstorms and how they happen. It gets into the problem of like butterfly effect sort of stuff, where it's like, yeah, one air molecule that we don't know the details about can cascade into not making it predictable anymore, or not making whatever model we had work. So I don't think we're ever going to, you know, be able to predict things on a rainstorm by rainstorm basis. And if that's what you're looking for in consciousness, then yeah, I don't think that's going to happen, because it can't, because, you know, uncertainty principle and all that. Not just because of computational complexity, because if it was just computational complexity, then you could imagine billions of years in the future we're spacefaring, we've taken over the galaxy, and we just make a computer the size of a planet that can calculate it, or something crazy like that. So if it was just a computational complexity thing, I'd say that it's not really a genuine problem.
How much of an understanding would we need to count as a win?
A way to frame this, because we did talk about computational complexity a lot, and I thought it mattered quite a bit, and Justin didn't think it mattered at all. I would say that we have to exceed the kind of understanding that we would have of, like, I think this is like a really crude way to put it, but I think NP versus P is not a crazy way to cut the issue. Like, I think currently we have maybe an understanding that we can check against things, but we don't have any kind of determinate deductive process to get from a state of affairs to an idea. And I don't think we'll ever get there. I think it's just too hard. It's not even too hard. It's hardwired into the formal properties of proofing and checking things in the first place. I think that that's like a very hard barrier to our understanding. It's not just something that we don't have time for. It's not just a pragmatic concern. It's like a thermodynamic concern. Like, even in this distant society, way, way in the future, billions of years from now, I don't think there's enough time between that society and the heat death of the universe to, like, get the level of understanding that you're interested in, which is like the progression of maybe the human mind through several moments. I had to drop heat death in there somewhere. I know Justin's going to yell at me for it real quick, because he doesn't know where I'm getting this.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, there certainly are things that you can say we won't be able to calculate until the heat death of the universe, but most of them are based on the amount of energy in the universe, and how, you know, if you had an ideal computer that could calculate it with the minimal amount of energy and stuff, then there just wouldn't be enough energy to calculate things. But to my mind, if your understanding of consciousness is like being able to predict all the rainstorms accurately on the planet, then
down to the
we're
raindrop.
not going to be able to get to that, because what?
I was just saying, like, down to the raindrop or something, right? Like,
yeah, like, we're not going to be able to get to that, because you're right, that is a lot to model. Though I think I said this before, it's not impossible to model, because it happens, which means, you know, it is being modeled by itself. And I don't think that consciousness is going to end up on that level, but it seems to me like we can have an understanding of how consciousness works, how neurons interact with each other to produce what we call consciousness, without even being able to simulate a human brain. Even if we don't have the computational power to simulate a human brain, we can still say we understand consciousness, because we understand rainstorms even if we don't have the power to simulate the entire atmosphere of the Earth and how it's interacting with the heat and all that.
Well, I still think we're trying to figure out what you know, and I expected this of this discussion is so much has to do with definitions and clarifications of terms. And so one of the things you'd said is that there's something definitionally about consciousness that makes it impossible to study because it's inherent to the definition of consciousness. It's not plainly studyable. But what is the why there again? Why is it, with, you know, besides the complexity of it, that somehow inherently has a boundary?
I guess this is all a riff on what the heart problem reports to say in the first place, which is the mode of thinking that we're doing when we're thinking of qualitative thought is a different kind of thing altogether than like quantitative thought or thought about more objective states of affairs. I kind of tried to harp on this with the semantics thing. It's not just that there's some, it's a way to say it maybe that to me there isn't a definition of consciousness. Consciousness is a thing that is not only very, very difficult to define, but there isn't like a single essential definition for like every conscious experience. Not one that we can like access and use, at least. If there was, then you're right. You're both right. You could just plug the definition into a determinable system, and it will go through and check everything, and it'll pick out all the consciousness from the not consciousness.
Yeah. So when you say there's a hard problem of consciousness, which definition of conscious are you using? Because that's all that counts for this whole conversation. The definition you're using in your post.
The definition that I am using, and that I think we should use as much as possible, is the natural contents of consciousness we happen to find. This is what I tried to appeal on the hardest, and this is why it's an argument that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because it's an argument from intuition. But as we were saying earlier, if things have like natural semantic contents, if things seem a certain way naturally, they just we just have qualitative experience of them, or they just have meanings. I'm using that. I'm using that thing that we all have access to. That kind of aboutness. It's not a quantitative definition. It's not a logical definition. It's not a definition by proof. It's a definition by like demonstration. And I'm just counting on everyone else as having experiences like mine. So I'm appealing to like our common experience. Like, just look around. Your experience. That's the definition.
And Justin, are you satisfied with that definition?
Yeah, I think so. I think that sounds reasonable enough.
Okay. So we'll call this the colloquial lay subjective understanding of what personal individual consciousness is. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. You know, it's not maybe all the folk attributions we give for ourselves, you know, that like angry is hot or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
Some things are clearly artifacts of culture, but it is the like authentic, unfiltered kind of conscious experience we have.
Okay, so the heart of that, I guess, then would be self-perception?
Yes.
Or would you separate that from the raw experience?
Well, I mean, self-perception is an example of consciousness. It's not what consciousness is. Animals, in theory, don't have robust self-impressions. They might have impressions of like being a body here now. If that's what you mean by a self-impression, that's cool. If what you mean is like a higher order awareness, like an intentional state about intentional states, I don't know if I can sign up for that.
So okay, so if it is that folk lay understanding of what our raw base experience it is, then Justin, from your point of view, what would satisfy an understanding of that in theory?
Let's see. I think if we could understand how the brain, like, you know, we know it takes inputs from your various senses and produces thoughts somehow. So if we knew what mechanism it uses to produce those, like how it produces those thoughts, and I think reasonably, if you could predict someone's thoughts, like you could say, given these inputs, this is what the person will think. That would be a good understanding. The problem is that as far as like your consciousness, your experiences are so what's the word? Reliant on your previous experience that it'd be difficult to capture all that previous experience in order to predict someone's thoughts. But I think if we could say, you know, when a sound goes into your ear, it takes this path through your brain and goes to these areas to produce these sorts of results. Even if you couldn't say it'll make you think of your 8th birthday, if we could say it'll make you think of things similar to it in these ways, like maybe if you heard a sound that was similar in these wavelengths, then it will cause these like I don't know. I feel like I'm not really making any sense.
I think you're making good sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we could do that, then that would be a good understanding in my mind.
And KD, would you call that win conditions? Would you accept those as win conditions?
If it's that kind of strong prediction, or if it's that level of prediction, I would say it's kind of weak. I would say that we already do, in some special cases, have that kind of knowledge of consciousness, you know? Like if you really have a close friend or family member and you guys have shared a lot of the same experiences and you know that person very well, you know how they differ from you, and you know how they're similar to you, then in theory you could make these kind of very accurate general predictions just by knowing the person. I feel like if that kind of like everyday knowledge is at the same level of strength as what we're going to get in science, then that kind of proof should be open to whatever camp. That's kind of like a given. Like, we all believe consciousness can be understood up to that point. Like, even if we're all just like Thetan spirits and we're going to lose our bodies after death, we all still have friends. And that kind of knowledge is possible. So, I mean, you can get strong prediction through, or at least prediction on that kind of level. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You might mean something more specific. I think you can get that kind of predictive accuracy through non-scientific means. That's what I would say to that.
Right. But if you could get it through scientific means?
I mean, it's kind of just par for the course that we understand consciousness. I mean, I'm not saying consciousness isn't regular. It's just that it's like chaotic and unpredictable. Like, there can be regular chaotic events. Like, every year in Oklahoma, there's tornadoes. The tornadoes are chaotic. Like, you can be reoccurring without being predictable or determinate in behavior. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, there's no hard problem of tornadoes, though. Tornadoes are an incredibly complicated system, but we know enough about weather cycles that no one really thinks of them as being somehow especially mysterious or different than other types of scientific research, other than maybe it's more complex. Is there anything more than complexity about consciousness that necessarily puts it outside of that?
Definitely. I think this first-person lay experience we all have is evidence. Like, we already talked about the illusion argument, that maybe consciousness is an illusion. And we can come back to that here if it's pressing. But unlike tornadoes, we have information, or maybe information would be too strong of a condition, but we have some kind of grok or acquaintance that there's some weird stuff going on here. The exact nature to that, how much we're reading into that, and how much we're bringing to the table are all questions that can be addressed. But if we think psychology is somewhat of a natural science and that we have ideas naturally and that it's not like an American thing to do or a Swiss thing to do, but a human thing to do, maybe an animal thing to do, then those kind of ideas that we're talking about.
Well, in science, the simplest problems were solved first, right? You know, and over time, you know, fields that were once, you know, even science was material philosophy, right? Before it matured into its own thing. And so over time, more fields drift towards being part of a hard science in one way or another. That process seems inexorable, one-directional. It's just a matter of it's the more complicated ones that take longer to wrap your arms around. I mean, wouldn't consciousness just be maybe it's the last domino to fall, but there's nothing in principle to say it couldn't?
That's a very popular idea to have. I think it misses how much of a loop we've been thrown through during the 20th century. You know, we used to think that mathematics was going to be inevitable. Like, Hilbert definitely thought it was going to be done in like 30 years. But that kind of optimism ended up reversing, and it turns out that all the things that he thought were possible in just a matter of time were never going to happen. I think quantum mechanics throws up some pretty big stumbling blocks. I'm not saying anything's impossible, but it doesn't seem like science is moving inevitably from least understood to more understood. It seems like there are plenty of hiccups for like paradigm shifts and things becoming more confusing before they become intelligible. I don't think it is just like a straight march into progress.
Would you say the overall trend has been towards progress, though? That we've on the most part, we've gained an increasingly accurate view of how the universe works over time?
I'm a bit of a skeptic, unfortunately. I just don't know how to assess that claim. I don't know one way or the other.
In an observation of the progress of scientific history. Like, if you want to get a better understanding of a randomized topic that you don't know ahead of time which topic it's going to be, and they say you can either be at the year 1900 or the year 1995, like, which year do you think you're most likely going to have a better understanding of a topic? You don't know what the topic is yet, but just be behind the veil. I mean, wouldn't you always just take the further down the line number because it's more likely going to be accurate?
I would say that has everything to do with economic conditions rather than some kind of like special access to the truth. Like, there are just more people alive today doing work that I could talk to. There are more people archiving today, so more work's preserved.
Oh, sorry. You don't get to talk to people. You just get to read the books in a flat moment in time that are in the established literature.
No, I mean, those books exist because printing's cheap and people get paid to print. Like in 1905, printing was more expensive, maybe not like Gutenheim press expensive. But I think your ease of mastery of a given topic there has everything to do with the fact that you just have more resources. You have just a raw amount of capital that just isn't there because there are fewer people and less history.
Well, I'm not sure where capital plays into this. I'm just talking about what the existing scientific knowledge is at the time. Regardless of whatever political system may have created it, I'm just talking about what's, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the fact that I would choose 1995 has everything to do with who's in 1995 rather than who's in 1905. Like, if I could go back in time with the whole staff of Harvard to like 1066 and study 1066 stuff, that'd be better than studying 1066 stuff from the future. But that's not an option because that's not how.
Right. Okay, but if you're dying of an illness, right, and you can only go to one point in history to get the best chance of that being cured, and at that time in history, you're getting available to all the existing literature up until that point in time. Life or death, do you take the later point in history, usually, because it's a better bet to live or die from whatever disease you have?
They couldn't afford to make the cortisol needed to stop my stroke in 1200. They just didn't have the resources. So I would pick later on because they're richer.
Okay, but scientific progress does have a trend towards a greater understanding of the operations of the universe as time moves forward. Is that fair?
Not really, I guess.
Justin, anything on that?
I mean, I think you know, a telling fact is you said that they were richer in the future than in the past, and that to my mind speaks kind of the same thing. That he's saying there's a general trend towards progress, and you're saying there's a general trend towards richerness. If there's a general trend towards richerness, is that not because of the general trend towards progress?
Those are the rewards, yeah.
It depends on how closely you want to link pragmatic success with the truth. Some of this has to be, some results within modern science are cargo cult results. You know, they're not replicatable in some cases.
Well, that's just bad science. But you wouldn't be like, oh, the stuff the Bill Gates Foundation is doing in researching curing diseases in third world countries is somehow some flashy capitalist modern world thing. It's like, no, it's just better science and they're kicking ass saving lives. Like that's like what? Sure. What's the?
I know I'm talking a lot about capital, but I'm not trying to be a communist. No, that's I can see how that's coming off as very like Midwestern leftist. It's not quite that bad. What's a good way to sum all this up? Maybe. Okay, let's take Newtonian physics. Perfect example. Okay. High degree of pragmatic success, yes. Incredibly high degree of applicability, yes. It almost applies to everything. Is it literally true for all things full stop? Does it have universal pretense? No. It's not just true full stop. It's true within certain parameters or within certain reductions within science. It depends on how you want to define it. You might want to put Newtonian physics as more central or less central, whatever. The point is, Newtonian physics is, without an argument, the most successful scientific paradigm that's ever existed. But it's also not entirely consistent. It's not 100% true. It's not 100% consistent with reality. And there are other models that supplanted it. So, I mean, there's a clear schism between just something working and something being true in the end. I mean, that's an example of something that worked for a long time and turned out to be just a little false.
So, again, back to this is there a trend towards progress as you go into the future? Like, yeah, but we didn't discover that Newtonian physics was wrong until we got to the future, where we had more information and were better able to tell that it wasn't consistent with the universe all the time, right? And is that not the general trend towards progress we're talking about?
It depends on... This really might depend on whatever implicit definition of science we're both using. I'm using science in terms of just like vulgar the things that scientists do. whatever people that call themselves scientists are doing. I don't want to get too deep into the demarcation problem. You guys can put forward maybe a more robust definition of science, but I don't know if it's really separable to say that you can really assess how effective the science is apart from the like means of production within the society. Like you guys are giving me lots of examples of like textbooks and medicines, things that societies produce to judge science by. And I could honestly chalk those up to either science or economics. I mean, it depends on which way you look at it.
Well, I'm just trying to limit the scope of this to the predictive capacity of models of the universe which have been developed over time by science. So science in its broadest sense is using methods, and science itself is a self-honing thing that improves definitionally over time, but it's basically just figuring out the best ways to sort out how the universe works and remembering those and reapplying those and developing that skill set alongside with the knowledge that it produces and continuing to test abilities to model the behavior of the reality we find ourselves inside of. So this is all agnostic of political systems or economics or anything. I'm just talking about best practices, whether it's how to do cognitive behavioral therapy or to use a test tube or to predict which stars will go supernova. Like, they don't all use the exact same set of tools, but those tools are all grounded in a core set of values that are saying we're going to test stuff and see if it works or it doesn't. There's a great metaphor that's used by a YouTuber named Potholer54, and he shows an animation of maps of North America from 700 years ago to today, right? I borrowed it a little bit on my Australia thing. And you can see how there's this weird, like, empty map and then, like, a weird blobby area for Baja California is like the size of everything up to Washington. That slowly over time, you see these maps congeal on one higher accurate description of the continent. And the reason it had to go that way is because there was only one way the continent was. So cartography is like, a science which got better and better. And, you add in things later like plate tectonics and you name it, that generally make it more sophisticated, but ultimately has to pass the test of representing reality accurately, or as accurately as it can. So that I'm saying science has gotten closer, like the map's gotten better. Our map of reality and the models generated by science have gotten closer and closer and better over time. That's all I'm arguing for. Is that fair? Did you grant that?
I think you're smuggling all the work into better and best practices. Like what
I'm trying to outline every single little thing, but there's no lost communication here. And I'm saying things that work good for making shoes, I don't need to go through every way to hit a nail, but you know what I mean.
No, I mean that wasn't meant to be a snide comment. I think it's one of the longest running problems in like contemporary philosophy is how much our brain corresponds to reality, the way our brain corresponds to reality, and whether correspondence to reality is what brains do in the first place. The map analogy works well, but I think what's underlying the better maps as it goes is that they become better and better for a purpose, for ship navigation, for whatever. I don't think that North America was essentially waiting to be mapped. And there might be some kind of weird node connective map that a computer could read that would give you a more accurate description of North America than any kind of physical map we could read.
Yes.
For example, the reason that picture is better at anything isn't because the machine has a better picture of North America than we do. It's because it does a better job at directing ships towards the shortest route or directing ships from point A to point B. It's for a purpose. It's not just like bare correspondence. It's not like we just found this stuff in the world.
I'm still not seeing how that affects whether or not science has increasingly got an accurate view of the world. What people do with that accurate view of the world is fine. What mariners want to do with cartography is fine. I'm just talking about accurately describing the behavior of the universe. That's it. No politics, no purposes, no whys is it discovered, just has it improved and gotten over time with mistakes, but generally more accurate to a true model of reality.
Well, you can't just test for just accuracy. You test for it by checking if it satisfies some other conditions. You can't just say, is it true? Can I just check for truth? You have to do a test. It's always intermediated through a test.
Well, of course, that's part of the scientific method. That's built in.
You were going to say something, Justin? Sorry.
Yeah, Justin, maybe you can help out here.
I mean, it seems I'm not really certain. Yeah, basically, I don't really see why you're worried about what the purpose of the map is. But the fact that it has gotten more accurate over time, just because we're building off of knowledge of previous generations that didn't exist in the past, and we have less that we need to discover, because a lot of it's already been discovered. All of this, to me, seems to trend towards a better understanding of whatever it happens to be, whatever topic. Is just, sure, there are times where you could make a mistake. Maybe the guy who is transcribing the map, adds a little bit off to the side because his hand slipped, and we have a worse understanding during that year. But as you go on, those mistakes get corrected, and I don't really see what your sticking point is on that. We've gotten a better understanding of the universe. You say, is it more true? And I'm not really certain why it wouldn't be. Like, it does seem more true, because if it's more accurate in describing what's going to happen, if the newer model is better at describing the results that we see, is it not better? Even if it's not true, it's better. It's closer to the truth because it's more accurate, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really yammering on about this connection between better and accurate. Like, I think you're both taking it for granted that the map became more accurate because it became better. It became more useful. Like, the map becomes to look more like North America looks like on our maps because it became refined for a given use. Your accuracy claim is only being propped up by other claims about the pragmatic use. Like, you wouldn't know that it's better unless it was more pragmatically useful, yeah? Like,
I presume there might be some connection between the urgency with which the technology is needed to the speed at which it's achieved, but that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm just saying, over time, has the model of reality developed by science gotten more accurate to reality itself?
And I'm saying I don't have like a cheat sheet to reality that I can check our models against. Like, I can only check for pragmatic usefulness and things like reasonability to believe, maybe facts about probability and statistics. And if this is as silly as it is, I'm going to feel very silly. But I'm hedging my bets against such a strong claim as accuracy. Like, I don't know if human beings ever have that kind of unmediated access to the truth that lets us make claims about whether something.
No. It's not about immediate access to the truth. It's about degree of confidence, right? Maybe I should have said precision instead of accuracy, but all I mean is, give me some charity on this here. Like you know what I'm getting at. I'm saying that the models generated by science over time have become closer to being able to describe and predict the behavior of reality.
If we're talking about precision versus accuracy, this is a non-problem. I just really wanted to hedge that bet.
Why get caught up on that?
I didn't know the word. I didn't think of it that way. If I had the word, I would have said it. I'm sorry. It was like a non-fight. Oh, but you asked me why didn't I just say it?
Yeah, like, why not say to me, you asked precision in the accuracy, and I said, oh, yeah.
Because I couldn't think of the word.
From the beginning, nothing's 100%, right? Like, it's that missing piece there, you know. It's maybe I'm not relating that very well. Justin,
I mean, are we in agreement now that we switched from accuracy to precision? Or
science goes from having less refined models to having more refined models, and those refinements indicate more content. Like, you can talk about more specific things, like things being hot.
Why is that refinement not accuracy?
Well, I mean, it may or may not be accuracy. It's all about the knowledge claim. Like, I don't know whether or not it's accurate or not. That's all I was trying to say. What I do know about firsthand is pragmatic concerns, and concerns maybe about, like, the consistency of statements within each other, maybe even like some brute probability facts.
All right. Well, But at least now that we're on the same page, the only reason I brought it up originally was to say that given that increase in scientific knowledge, don't you think there's a good chance we might just zoom in on this consciousness problem, and after unlocking a bunch of stuff that we didn't even think of before or didn't even think was possible? Or I'm not even saying it will happen. I'm just saying, like, is that scenario all that outlandish to you?
I think it implies that consciousness is within the band of things that science is narrowing in on. If consciousness is the kind of thing that science just doesn't study, so science is in the business of public things, or in this business of like the relation between things abstractly, maybe mathematics. I don't know where you want to include mathematics in all that scheme. But it's either pure mathematics or it's empirical science. If consciousness is the kind of thing that you don't study using either method, then it's just never going to narrow in on it. If it's just a question of refining those two ways of approaching questions, our question isn't in that general category. So
if we establish why, though, I mean,
if we go back to like the 4-part division that we were talking about at the very beginning of OP, you have your 4 divisions. You have public things that are assertive. That's going to be your empirical sciences. I give whatever reason to think that you're not going to find consciousness there because of the difference between the objects of study empirically and the objects of study of consciousness, whatever. I also allow that, you know, you can use math if you're going to do science. Maybe they're not really separable. But I also established that mathematics is a pretty unlikely way to study consciousness because consciousness isn't like an abstract thing. It actually happens in concrete. It happens to us, yada, yada. So because of those two concerns, because of the way I set up OP, and the way the classification schemes, that's what rules science out. So my argument from illusion makes it unlikely that we'll study conscious objects empirically, and my argument against mathematical consciousness argues against like a rationalist interpretation of mental processes. I don't know where I'm going with that.
We've gone much longer than I thought here, and I think we should sort of try to get to a final word. As expected, it's a topic that's got all kinds of strange potential tangents and everything. It's at the core of so many other things. So I do appreciate you all taking the time to walk around and explore on this. But I thought maybe if we could just go one by one and kind of wrap out, unless you guys wanted to cover anything else.
For all of our sakes, I think I can stop talking.
Yeah, I don't think this is the kind of thing that's gonna, be solved in a night or anything like that. We've been talking about it for, you said 2 months, so
it's been nuts. It's been a lot of fun though. It's been really nice to meet you, Justin.
Yeah, it's been great. Mm-hmm. I hope we continue the conversation because I feel like I've learned a lot, and it's just fun to talk about it. So
yeah, totally. I didn't want to finish my last post before the conversation, so there we go.
Well, now maybe you'll have a few more people jumping in before it, before the year runs out and it gets archived. KD, let's just start with you for last word, and then Justin, and then I'll sign off.
Okay. So the long and short of it, I know I'm definitely in the minority of opinion of most modern human beings living in the Western world when I say that consciousness is non-physical. But I mean, the long and short of it, all I want to say is that I don't mean anything terribly spooky by that. I don't believe in life after death or ghosts or anything like that. That's not a necessary part of any of this. What this is really about is whether information can spontaneously be arranged to give rise to consciousness. You have to have some kind of functional procession between dead matter and living consciousness. You're never going to find the link. And I don't know. I'm so tired. That's got to be it. I'm just going to pass the buck. Speech over.
Thank you, Katie. And Justin?
Yeah, and I just sit on the other side where I think that consciousness is just a consequence of the physical construction of the brain, and given that, there's no reason science couldn't touch it because science can touch all sorts of physical things. So why would this be any different? But yeah, it's not going to be something that we're going to come to a conclusion on, and I'm not even sure we're going to come to a conclusion on it in our thread or ever. But it's fun to talk about.
Maybe it's the climb.
Ain't that the truth? All right. Well, thank you both very much. This has been a marathon, but you were really, and you're in time zones where it's a little harder on you, so I know it's getting later. So thank you very much for the time and the focus, and I look forward to seeing how that thread develops in the future.
Oh, thank you for having us on. It's really been great for me. I don't know about Justin. Yeah.
Yeah. It's been fun.
Thank you to our guests, KDJones and Awenonian, for an interesting discussion. Thanks to Snorlax for continuing to lead our sub and keeping on me to finish these episodes. And of course to Botson Driving His Worst for all the audio engineering magic, doing his best with the quality of the audio that I do provide him. If you have made it this far, you are a hero. PM me on Reddit at Mehatch, user Mehatch, and I will literally give you Reddit gold for the first 5 listeners who message me the code words John Denver. That's John Denver. Get some Reddit gold because you made it this far. Seriously. And if you'd like to add into the conversation, give us your thoughts on consciousness. Join us in the Reddit sticky post for episode 6. Or if that's past, you can find us in the episode 6 part of the podcast wiki on Change My View. Or tweet to us at the CMV Podcast. All one word, all lowercase, at the CMV Podcast. Good night.